Hi, everybody. This is Bob Ost. Welcome to our monthly panel for January. That's Thursday, January 28th. We're going to be talking about developing new works in a virtual new world. Many of us thought back in March when shutdown hit that was the end. There was nothing we could do. It was going to be totally about life on pause, life on hold. We're all beginning to learn that there are things that still can be done. I was particularly interested in hearing what the differences are in terms of dealing with COVID and being artistically productive and just making art happen in different parts of the world. I mean, we have Katy Lipson from London, Neil Gooding from Australia, and Cody Lassen, who's right here with us in New York. So hopefully we'll learn what our differences are, and we'll also learn what the things are that we're all going through that are pretty much the same. I would like to now just start introducing my guests and have you say a little bit about where you are, who you are, what you're doing. Don't go too much into detail because we'll get into more of that later. Katy, since I know you're the most tired of all of us, it's 11 o'clock there. It's 11:04 to be exact. So Katy, say hi and thank you for staying up and being with us.
That's fine. Thanks for having me. I am an independent producer. I run a company called Aria Entertainment. We're about 8 years old and we're quite well known for focusing on musical theatre, mainly rare musicals that haven't been seen for a long time and redoing them in a boutique way. And also new musicals. We have our own festival called From Page to Stage, which supports 8 new musicals a year in a festival format. We've run that for 6 years and we have a full-time literary department for new musicals. We've produced over 65 productions ranging from 200 seats to 2,000 seats. And over the next 3 to 5 years, we have a real commitment to commissioning and developing new musicals. And I guess another thing that I did was set up a theatre out of London in an area called Manchester, which is probably our second biggest city for culture. And it was sort of taking the model of the Many A Chocolate Factory, which you might have heard of because of some of the transfers to Broadway, taking rarer shows like your Pippins and your Mames, and we did Yank and we did Spring Awakening and Parade, and bringing them to the North, because believe it or not, a lot of these beautiful musicals are not seen out of London ever. So we sort of had a commitment to that, and it got a lot of recognition.
Katy, I just want you to know that from our point of view, you have a very wide range of musicals there, because Yank for us was I loved that show. I absolutely adored that show, but it was at the York Theatre, and it was an off-Broadway show for us. But then when you go to Mame and others that you know, those are like our blockbusters.
Yeah, but we're taking Mame and doing it with Tracy Bennett and a cast of 17, so completely stripping it back to a boutique piece with no automation, no fly tower, very creative staging, and doing pieces like, Pippin. We did Rags actually after the Goodspeed Opera House production. We then did a new production with Stephen Schwartz and took it to London. And a lot of these shows we moved to London. So it kind of cut my teeth and started me off on a path to raising higher investment to do larger scale touring in West End, and obviously getting money into sort of seed capital pot to invest in new writing. So many years sort of cultivating a brand, a company, investors, ideas, relationships. And now we were at a very exciting point of launching several commercial shows and development.
I'm going to stop you, because that's going to be when we start talking about the pivot.
Yes,
okay, we're going to get to the pivot. Farthest away from us right now is Neil Gooding in Australia. Again, tell us about you and about what you've done. Don't necessarily take us into how things have changed. We'll get to that as a separate question. Okay.
Well, listening to Katy, I think I've got a fairly similar story to Katy, to be honest. So, so started out as an independent producer and director in Sydney, Australia, and because we don't have the well-established, flourishing development system of say New York at the moment, that led to producing several new Australian musicals, which had been quite a while since they were done on any scale. And then that's led to 10 years really of trying to figure out a way with the government funding and with the structures that be here of what's a better model for developing musicals in Australia and developing writers and getting mentoring to Australian writers who are a long way away from the rest of the world, except for cast recordings and YouTube. And so that led to, very similar to Katy, set up a theatre in Sydney called the Haze Theatre, which does do a similar breadth of shows in a smaller theatre, which for us are considered to be like, even though it's Mame, Australia wouldn't have had a professional production of Mame in 30 or 40 years. So there is a chance to reimagine those kind of musicals into a smaller theatre. And that Haze Theatre also led to a program called New Musicals Australia, which was basically the first government-funded development process in Australia that I set up with Chris Stewart, who you may know from setting up NYMF in Australia.
Absolutely. Chris Stewart started NYMF. He actually sat down with a bunch of us. I was one of the people that he said, I want to do this. And we started talking about how he was going to put that together. I was happy to hear you mention Chris. He's an old friend.
Yeah. He's getting older. Please tell him I said that. Please tell him. So now
I can tell you what he'll say back, but I won't say it. Yeah,
exactly. And so now I'm based in New York, but I am actually back in Sydney at the moment, working on a new show called Drummer Queens, which is a bit of a departure for me because I usually work on text-based shows, and this is very much a music event, a bit like a Stomp or Blue Man Group. And we open in Sydney next week, and I'm down here doing that because we currently can.
Well,
which is
you're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead.
Okay.
I've got to manage this somehow. And you mentioned one phrase that I want to come back to because it's a hugely important phrase: government funding. I want you to know that that's a foreign phrase to us in America. And we're going to move on to...
Oh, I don't want to give the wrong impression. It is not like Australia is. Musical theatre in Australia is the largely unrepresented art form. They will fund opera, they will fund classical music, they'll fund dance. Musical theatre, until the last 5 or 6 years, has been totally unfunded by the government in Australia.
Okay. I was excited for a moment. I thought we had someone to look up to.
No.
So I'm going to move to Cody. Cody, you talk a little bit about you pre-COVID. Maybe I should have said that pre-COVID.
First, I don't like that I had to go after Katy. We need an accent filter on Zoom. Like those two accents are beautiful, and I have ugly American one. So that's my feature request I'm putting in.
Yours is charming.
Katy and Neil, I pale in comparison, but I adore them both as people and colleagues. So I produce, for the most part, commercial theater, everything from 99-seat storefronts to Broadway. I had 2 shows running, one about to start when COVID hit that got shut down and will hopefully one day come back. What else? I think that's it. That's me in a nutshell.
Well, okay, then basically, let's talk about what happened when COVID hit for you, and what choices, what changes were there for you? There were obvious ones, but if we could dig into it a little bit. And also, by the way, I want to let everybody know that I remind you, there is a hand raise, a virtual hand raise, if you have any comments or questions, and you can always put your comments and questions into the chat as well. And I'll do my best with the help of Jay and Sandy to follow any threads that you want to actually toss out at the panelists. So Katy, in London, what's it been like?
So on March 16th, which was the day our final performances, I was actually in a tech for a new production and heard about Broadway shutting and knew it was coming any day for us. So I had to close 2 productions. One was on second preview and the other was a week in. One was The Last 5 Years, a new actor musician version. And one was a new version of The Mask of Zorro with the music of the Gypsy Kings. And we'd spent a lot of money on reimagining that show. And, I literally had to unproduce both of them instantly. So as I'm sure a lot
I have to ask you, what does unproduce mean?
Well, emailing the agents and emailing the investors and figuring out where the set's going to go and the lighting and the costumes and trying to get any money back that you haven't spent on marketing, and figuring out how much overcall you might need because you want to pay the actors with the unions for the weeks they didn't play, but you actually haven't got enough money in the box office, and figuring out with the theatre, how are you going to solicit the customers? You know, are the customers going to donate their ticket money to the producer or to the venue, or they're going to do some sort of, you know, split of it together? And that's a very interesting topic. And remember, this was March a year ago, when we didn't know how long this would go on, and venues didn't know how long they would be needing money, and independent producers were left with so many difficulties. I mean, there were some people that had already paid for venues up front and couldn't get their money back. And there were other venues that were very happy to say, look, I can't give you my space, so of course I'll refund you the money. So I had two very different experiences with those shows. What I did then was I sat back, I had conversations with commercial producers from all different scales, as well as the venues. But I was most keen on figuring out a way to open up the last 5 years as soon as possible. Luckily for me, I had a show that was two people, not necessarily really cheap, but obviously different. I couldn't really relaunch the Mask of Zorro show as easily as I could relaunch the last 5 years, because that had already sold out all its tickets, had a great sort of audience following, had already got great reviews, had had its press night. And so from March till about summer in the UK, for those of you that don't know, we entered a phase of reopening our theatres with social distancing in about August, September. So there was always this talk about, can we reopen the economy, restaurants and event spaces with social distancing in mind, to keep a good 3-meter gap between you. So the Southwark Playhouse, the venue I was doing the last 5 years, completely reconfigured the space. And we do have a lot of public support, and there was lots of grants getting given to these non-for-profit theatres that were charities, to help them get foggers for their spaces, to sort of sterilize the space, and also to insert sort of plastic screens between seats to create a barrier. Can you believe it? But it was true, between audience members. So people were sat in these little pods when they came back to my show when we reopened in September. So I have
a question about that, though, because
yeah.
The economics, we're all facing this. I mean, New York, Australia, London, the economics of performing to a minimal house, where you're not going to be able to break even. How do you deal with that?
Well, the economics in England are very different to America, and I'm sure all of you know that. It's a lot cheaper to produce in England, but it's also a lot harder to make money. We don't have strict union rules for off if you're not in the West End. You have to pay and be an ethical producer and pay people a living wage, but you're not obliged to have X amount of stage managers, or you're not got the astronomical costs. So I had a show that was already capitalized at £50,000 for this small musical, of which we'd already paid that money, we'd already spent it, and we'd already done a week of the show, and we got some donations from the audiences back again. So I had to recapitalize the show by putting back all that money in, plus a little bit extra. My running costs were the same, but I knew that if I ran for 6 weeks at socially distant with 50% capacity, so 3-week normal run, but 6 weeks, that I could maybe recoup £40,000 out the 50. And when I started the show, I'd only had £10,000. So actually it was worth the punt, because I would make some more money back. And at the same time, we set up a streaming relationship with a new platform called Stream.Theatre. They invested in the show, they came to film it with 4 cameras, and we streamed that, and we took another £25,000 on the box office. So we're hoping that we'll actually end up fully recouped in the next week, which is, quite remarkable.
So actually what you're telling us is an actual success story during COVID.
That was a success story.
Which is more than I was expecting. So
I was lucky. I had a show that had, thank God we got to press night before COVID hit, because it was seen as a hit show. It was seen as something people wanted. The last 5 years, it's a cult show, as you know. Southwark Playhouse is a very unique space. You put on a revival in this 200-seat venue, and you're pretty much banking on taking 80-90% on your shows like Pippin and Promises, which I did there, and the Toxic Avenger and Aspects of Love. And basically they have a strong, loyal audience because the quality of the shows are very high, and the ticket price is less than $30. So people go, and you, as a producer, you kind of know your economic model there. You know what you can spend, you know what you can take, you know where your break point is. So I knew that audiences would be hungry to come back, and at the worst situation would be that that it would close again. And how far could I go? So there was nothing to lose. I could only make back some of the money I'd already lost. On the other hand, we had 3 commercial productions. We had the Addams Family tour, we had the Osmonds tour, we've got a tour of Little Voice, the Rise and Fall of Little Voice, and all of them just have fallen apart and have to be rebooked for 2021. And as of today, the general gist is that we're not going to be taking these shows on tour even this year. So we're talking about a 22 opening, and then we're all worried about availability, because in England there's only really 35 strong touring venues for musicals, and if Cameron Mackintosh wants Les Mis in them, or Phantom, or Disney want The Lion King, we're all going to lose our dates. We're all going to be second fiddle to these big branded shows that the venues need their ticket sales to replenish their reserves. But so I lost 3 tours, I lost 2 productions. We managed to reopen last 5 years. And I also picked up a piece from Paris, which was an innovative outdoor app-based promenade piece where you turn up at a location, download an app, put in your headphones and follow these actors down the streets of London. And that was a lovely little success story at a time when theatres couldn't open and we could do outdoor theatre. And we ran that for 6 weeks, and now we're finding international collaborations and licenses around the world. And that took me sort of last year.
Well, that certainly says that you weren't idle during COVID.
Definitely not. I was busier than ever.
Yeah, one of the questions was, what do we do during this period of shutdown? Cody, I'm going to jump to you because I think the contrast with what you went through with your Broadway shows is a steep contrast, but interesting. And one of the things that you did, I was going to ask you, Katy, do your theaters have insurance? Do the producers have insurance? That's one of the things that we're dealing with right now, is that there were these force majeure clauses that everybody's dealing with right now.
Well, at first, no. First, it was no. No one has clauses for a pandemic. But last week, they announced in The Stage, which is our theatre paper, that there's going to be massive payouts to the venues that did have some sort of clause for a pandemic in their contract. They didn't say who, the lucky producers were, but insurance companies have been ruled by the high courts that they have to pay out. So I'm sure it's big producers that own West End theatres, because I don't know who would have that clause. I certainly wouldn't have that level of insurance, not even cancellation insurance on an off West End production.
Right.
It's too expensive. I've done it on tours, but all you're getting on an off West End show is public liability, employer liability, and a little bit of asset protection. But so yeah, that's that. But obviously, about our government bailout, and we've put £2 billion into theatres and theatre companies at the moment, but there's no guidance. So people are spending that money on activity and then getting themselves into more debt when that activity is cancelled. It all feels very disorganized, and there's no real plan for this crazy amount of money,
So I'm going to take an intermediate step to Neil, because I wonder if you're in a similar situation with Katy in terms of any kind of insurance that is going to help you. And I think Cody's going to have some things to say about it as well, but it's a whole different level, because we're talking the more expensive shows.
Look, Katy and I may as well be living the same life at the moment, listening to her story. I had very similar.
It's amazing how much you look alike too. It's just
it's
uncanny.
Very true. It's very true. So I had a very similar thing where I just opened the Australian premiere of Bridges, Madison County on March the 11th, and on March the 12th.
My birthday.
That's why we did it then, Bob. And then I was flying back to New York on March the 12th, and on March the 18th, I was supposed to be flying to Manchester to see Back to the Future, which I'm one of the co-producers of. And on my flight back, the warning signs were there with COVID. Like in our tech week for Bridges, Madison County, there was already people cancelling tickets, people getting scared because it was in the news. But on March the 12th, when I flew out, I was kind of like, right, back to New York, and I was waiting on a friend to say, yes, I've got your 6 opening night tickets for 6. And by the time I got to LA, Broadway had been shut. So that was carnage, because I mean, always in my life, I'm juggling a mix of shows that they're my babies and I've driven them from scratch, like Bridges was that. And I had a tour of a Joni Mitchell show in the USA. And then on the flip side, I've always got a few other shows like Back to the Future and Room in Canada that I'm a co-producer on, which is, you know, not the same thing. When you're used to being a leading producer that drives shows, they're kind of where you raise money and you get involved, but you're not driving it. So there was a lot of cancellations, but yeah, the insurance question is a tricky one. I think similar to London or similar to America, our policies were already like at a small to medium scale, you didn't have insurance. So we don't have cancellation insurance that's affordable. But there was, depending on which contract you had, and this is what I think is now going to really hurt theatre moving forward. Some contracts excluded epidemics and pandemics from force majeure and from just, you know, cancellation side of things, and some didn't. And that's the battle that's been going on for the last year. Like I see what Katy was saying in London, and I know the same thing in the USA. Like, you know, some producers and some theatres have been arguing for the last year that they are entitled to insurance as a payout. The issue moving forward that I know we're all dealing with in every country, and we're exactly like the UK and the USA, and this is that there will not be a policy ever moving forward that allows a claim for a pandemic or an epidemic, which is a huge problem for all producers, because particularly on Broadway, if your show is going to take 5 to 7 years to be developed to get to Broadway, and then you want to run for 10 years, over those 15 years, the globe has seen 2 or 3 epidemics that may well have become pandemics. And we no longer know what the government's reactions worldwide are. Like next time people start getting sick in France, does every government, and particularly Australia, does Australia just shut its borders instantly, or shut down cities like happened a few weeks ago in Brisbane when there was 1 case and the Shrek opening night was, you know, totally trashed for another week? Because until we have a good government policy and health policies that we, with some assurity, know how our leaders are going to react, and it's a balance between public health as a priority and everything else. But theatre cannot just keep getting shut down the minute people get sick. Otherwise, we have no business model.
Cody, so let's come to New York for a second. And I know it's been really tough for producers here in New York. I'm suspecting that it seems like it's been tougher than it may have been in London and Australia. But we don't know that.
I think a different kind of tough. I think it's been tough across the board.
Yeah.
But I had a show in London, a co-production with the Chocolate Factory, which is, you know, I loved Katy saying unproducing a show, which is a term that I wish I never heard. But, you know, shows are not designed to close quickly. Even shows that, you know, flop financially, you generally have the writing on the wall and you have time to wind down in an orderly manner. So, you know, things like getting designers and American cast members back from London on short notice when, you know, we were worried borders were going to be closing. And, you know, do we keep paying rental fees for the lighting and sound equipment in the theater? Just all things you never really think of that you have to go through quickly. And we were in previews in London, and then I had another show in New York that we had just started tech. For both shows, actually, for every show I do, I'm what my general managers would always say is underinsured for things like business interruption insurance. I'm always very well covered, you know, to Katy's point earlier, for liability and things like that. I always have enough to wind down a show quickly, but my thinking always had there ever been an event big enough to need that policy, A, there probably wouldn't be enough money to go around and insurance companies would fight us, and B, even if they honored the policy, in a best case scenario, that's a many month process to make a claim, have them investigate the claim, and then pay you out. I mean, by that point, you're out of money and you're in a lot of trouble. So I didn't have business interruption insurance, but I had never really counted on that. And I think my hunch there is, you know, kind of came true, that a lot of our colleagues got a very, very small fraction of what they, you know, think they rightfully deserve. And I don't disagree with them. And even the ones who did get money, you know, it took a long time to get to them. And to Neil's point, yeah, I don't think there will be, at least an affordable policy to cover this going forward. So I think we need to lean on the government to provide some sort of support there, or just accept that this is one of a million risks that you need to take when producing new work.
So, Cody, let me ask you this, because since a lot of us are here in America, and we have somebody from Yorkshire and we have somebody from Vancouver, but what do you see anything, any opportunities that have been afforded in London and Australia that you think were, compare how America was responding to this as opposed to how things have been going in London and Australia and other places. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I mean, I think it goes without saying that the government here, the previous administration excluded, just historically, the government doesn't support arts the way most other countries do. And then very specifically, the most recent administration not only supported art, even less, but didn't necessarily have any kind of plan to help any business sector get through this. So I think that's probably the biggest. And I know the governments in Australia and the United Kingdom had their own issues, but I think we were really just kind of left adrift to fend for ourselves. So I think that was probably the biggest issue. And also just the dollar amounts are much higher, right? A Broadway show is typically looking at, anywhere from $400,000 to more than $1 million a week just to keep the lights on and keep going.
So Katy, from your point of view.
Bob, can I jump in there for a second? Oh, sorry,
Well,
Bob. You go.
Katy and Neil, from your point of view, looking at America, what are you grateful for in your country that allowed you to have some possibilities that may have made things maybe easier? I might be wrong. You might be as miserable as we've been.
Look, I don't think it's. So I've been living in America through most of the pandemic. I only came back to Australia 6 weeks ago, just for this project. A couple of things I would say. One is Australia is very geographically lucky. Like we are a big island in the middle of nowhere, and if you want to close your borders to the world, you can do that, and that largely keeps COVID out. The government here, which still gets a lot of criticism, but compared to America, they did quite early come in with support for theatre companies, or what you call the non-profit companies in America. Those companies like Australian Opera and the Sydney Theatre Company, Melbourne Theatre Company, they got support relatively early, so they had some kind of assurity they were going to survive. Where Australia has never really been particularly generous is to what anyone would consider to be commercial theatre productions. So at that level in Australia, the government don't really get involved very much. But they have, and what the show I'm working on now has been a recipient of a chunk of that money, is they did come out with a plan that is, the better part of you're talking billions again, like they're big amounts of money. But one of the plans was largely, I think it was I might get my numbers wrong here, but it was $100 million or more to support commercial theatre producers, essentially, to work out how to get their work moving back out. So there's been some pretty amazing work that's been able to continue. The big question here, and I guess Katy can talk to London. I mean, New York obviously isn't open at all. London tried to open and has had a disaster and had to shut down, and everybody got wiped out. So I think everybody is kind of looking to Australia because we're more similar to the USA and London than, say, South Korea and some of those cultures. But what's happening here is our shows are now opening. Our theatres are full. But not many producers are doing particularly well. Like it's rewarding to have shows open and actors are back being employed. But the end result is that there's actually too many shows in Australia. Let me stop you on that. So Australia is open, and it's not limited in terms of the audience. It's not socially distanced. No, it's limited. So that's state by state. New South Wales went from 50% capacity. It's now at 75%. Brisbane went from 0 to 50, is now at 100%, but Brisbane was shut down. And Melbourne has only just, because Melbourne was the hardest hit city in Australia for COVID. It was actually on lockdown for 3 months.
I think you're the guys that were watching, because our plan, as I understand it, is going to be to reopen, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll see, to 50% capacity, I think is what was projected.
Well, the issue with that, Bob, is I can't think of many shows at all, even small to medium scale shows that can survive at 50%. And
that's what I was saying earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I'm finding in Sydney is, and I think one thing that you can see it from what was planned to open in May when I've got Back to the Future opening in London, like there's 10 or 12 mega shows all opening within 2 or 3 weeks of each other. Whether or not May is a realistic opening for anything in London now is, I can't imagine it compared to where they are. But the thing to learn from Australia is Brisbane at the moment is a healthy market because Brisbane essentially has one, or with respect to Chris Stewart, because he runs a venue up there, 2 theatres. And Sydney, what we're finding is that there are people that want to buy tickets. There are people that want to go out, whether they want to sit in, because Australia has not been good at wearing masks. But there is
really, I didn't know that.
They only made it compulsory a few weeks ago when there was an outbreak. So it's been a largely COVID-free country. Like you come down here and you would barely know that COVID exists, except for checking in with QR codes to restaurants. So Australia's really, really avoided the brunt of COVID when you've lived in New York. The issue in Sydney is that when theatres have reopened, and Melbourne's doing the same now, every theatre and theatre company, including ones that don't particularly like musicals and don't do musicals very often, they've all gone back and gone, people love musicals, so we're going to relaunch, and we're all relaunching around the same time. And so there is currently more musicals on sale in Sydney than you would ever have sustained prior to COVID. And my reading of that is, and I might be wrong on this, but is that there is an audience that wants to go. That audience is smaller than it was pre-COVID. They want to pay less money, and they're being offered 2 or 3 times the number of shows they would normally have gone to see. And so no show is doing particularly well. What you're getting is a wash where some shows are getting really hurt. Even the bigger shows like Frozen, they're doing better than others, but they're not doing anywhere near what Disney would have normally done with Lion King in Australia. And so you just get this mush where everybody is battling to put their shows on because they've had a year to sit around and work out what they're going to do. And yet nobody is really doing very well.
But we're envious because you're doing well.
Yes.
And doing is a very good thing.
But if producers can't cover their costs doing it, what's the point?
I know.
Yeah.
And which was an earlier point that I said was basically how do you make it financially feasible when you're running at 50% capacity?
In England, it's so embarrassing how many announcements and cancellations have happened in the last year because of misguided government advice. We have been shut down.
We don't know about that here. We don't have anything like that.
Well, at least it's one direction of something. Ours is hopeful, bad, hopeful, bad, hopeful, bad. We closed in March. We then closed in November. We then closed in December. Literally. So when shows were opening with social distancing in the commercial sector here, it was very sporadic. Nika Burns, one of the theatre owners, she opened up her theatre, Six the Musical, big seller, usually sells out 300 seats in the small West End theatre, moved to one of Nika's larger theatres at 700 seats to run at social distancing with 400 seats. The Play That Goes Wrong did the same. Cameron McIntosh eventually announced a concert of Les Mis. So these were shows that had money in the bank or knew that they could sell out. So from a ticket capacity, we were finding huge enthusiasm for returning to the theatre. Someone did a concert of Alan Menken and Lynn Aron's Christmas Carol with an orchestra in the Dominion Theatre on top of the Prince of Egypt set. That was going to sell out, socially distanced, and that theatre's humongous. So even socially distant, it was 1,000 seats. They had to close it 12 shows in because of the third lockdown. So sales weren't an issue here. All the non-for-profits that got funding started launching small productions, but then it was, that is now cancelled, or this show is now cancelled. And we have just had so much enthusiasm and excitement for shows, and then closures again because the government's decided to close the restaurants and hotels and theatres 3 times now. So really, it was sporadic. Only the shows that could afford could open. The rest of the theatres were dark. The big shows stayed shut. The Evan Hansen's, The Come From Away, the Les Mis, the Phantom. And then, we've had kind of small, lots of concerts, lots of people at home doing concerts on West End stages that are streamed live, but a very disjointed theatre ecology, vibrant but disjointed and quite varied in form and stuff.
So Neil, what did Australia do to manage to minimize the COVID the impact of COVID. New Zealand, I was very well aware of, was a very early success story. How about Australia? Because you're saying that that you're not wearing masks. So what is your secret down there? Oh, we don't have your voice. We don't have any voice.
You would think after a year of Zoom, I would have worked that out, right? The mute button.
Yeah.
So the secret really is to be Australia and New Zealand, to be islands in the middle of nowhere, and to be largely in warmer weather. So what they were able to do much more successfully than, say, the UK or the USA, is when Australia closes its borders, there's a limited number of flights into Australia from a limited number of ports around the world. So what the flip side of it has been, and there's a lot of anger in Australia about this, is that there are a lot of Australians stranded around the world. Like getting home for this show and getting home previously, I got just lucky, and it's expensive, and then you have to quarantine for 14 days, which you pay for. But there are tens of thousands of Australians that have lived in London and South Africa and Dubai or wherever they are that cannot get home. So that's the downside of the policy. I don't want to say the government has done a good job of managing COVID here. Listening to scientists helps, but the flip side is that it's not been without ramifications. Like there's a lot of anger from Australians that are stuck around the world. The other thing I would say is that, without trying to America bash it, the fundamental reason that Australia can sort of do even what it's doing is exactly what Katy said. And Katy said, our cost base is lower, and until America starts, New York in particular, starts dealing with its cost base of shows. And I haven't heard many discussions about a rationalization of costs. And because what we know here is that people will not pay the same ticket prices that they were paying pre-COVID. And that bubble that I think existed for almost a decade, at least on Broadway, of premium ticket pricing and stuff, that relies on tourists, and it relies on, Australia doesn't rely on tourists for our shows. Like Harry Potter is just about to reopen in Melbourne. Come From Away started again last night with its official opening. Those shows, of course, pick up some tourists, but they generally are sold locally. You know, that we're not relying on tourists from around the world or even outside of the cities they're playing on the same way that America does. And the final point I'd make is, in terms of one of the things I did to pivot, was I was asked to direct a virtual production of Who's Your Baghdaddy.
This was actually what I was about to get to. This is the next point of conversation.
Right. Okay. I'll leave it to that then. But there's some fundamental rules around how like we don't have Equity and SAG-AFTRA arguing amongst themselves about who has jurisdiction on that. And the equity rules in Australia allow you to do that kind of project, or to develop a musical in a way that you can't do in New York at this point in time.
So I know that Jane Dubin's going to be a guest for us tomorrow, and I know that one of her particular concerns is the fact that the infrastructure, the Broadway infrastructure, is probably not going to hold up post-COVID, which is what you're saying essentially.
Well, and there's people like me that, you know, I'm still getting proposals for shows, and the problem that New York has always been the leader. Like, you know, everybody wants to be on a Broadway show, but the reality right now is, you know, if Katy brings me a project in London, or you know, if I'm bought shows in South Korea, which I'm looking about, there are very, very rapidly growing, maturing markets around the world that don't need to be in New York. And money at this point in time is better placed outside of New York financially. Not so much in terms of the creatives that are working there and the shows that might be developed in New York, but the financial deals are horrible.
Cody, would you like to speak to that at all?
I agree. Yes. No, I mean, yeah, it's just a totally different system. And, you know, also in most other countries, you have the theater community, whether that's unions or not, coming together and saying like, look, we might all need to take some temporary painful cuts to get things restarted and then get back to where we were. You know, that's just not realistic for us to think that we're going to all sit at a table and say we can do things for half the price we used to do them for. We're going to have to find ways to cut costs. There's going to be some pain felt by everyone. You know, the only thing we have to look at is the Spanish flu in 1918, and that saw 2 years of depressed average ticket prices that were about 20% less than normal. So I assume we'll, at the very least, see that, probably more than that. Yeah, it's just a whole different ballgame. We'll come back. We don't know when. We don't know. We have a good idea about when. We don't know exactly when, and we don't know what it'll look like, but we'll find out soon.
And did you actually finish telling us about unproducing your shows?
Oh, I mean, it's just, it was truly just a scramble of everyone involved. Getting people home from overseas, getting our casts in New York tested, back when it was impossible to get a test. Things like, automation and all these computers and everything, they're not designed to, be mothballed and sit there collecting dust. And, do we keep paying? Who do we keep paying, right? It doesn't make sense to pay PRG to rent all these lights that are sitting in an empty theater. On the same token, it doesn't make sense to have them come and rip all the lights out and take them back to their warehouse. And then in the back of your mind, trying to think, okay, like what am I doing now, and how is that going to affect reopening? And what makes sense to kind of risk burning a bridge or pissing someone off now, and what absolutely has to be taken care of now that there's no reversing.
Okay, a reminder to the room that you can do a virtual hand raise, or you could put a question or a comment into the chat if anything has occurred to you as we've been talking, because I like to hear what other people are thinking as well. I want to reluctantly move to, not reluctantly, it's just there's so much to talk about here, and America's response to COVID has been just so horrible. I don't know what to say. It's just, I think we're back on a track. We're back on a track right now. At least we have a new administration that believes in science and believes in actually making plans. And hopefully things are going to be improving for us here. The main thing is that what we're all hoping for is a day when we reach a point where COVID no longer is a threat because enough people are immune. The herd immunity thing. So yes, there's going to be a transition. Yes, we're going to be having to do socially distanced theater. Everybody's going to have to be masks. They're not wearing masks in Australia, you said.
Oh no, they are in theatres. They're not in
are.
society, but they are in theatres, which is a bit of a barrier, because people that aren't wearing them to go shopping and aren't wearing them to go to schools then are putting a mask on in a theatre, and it's a bit of a jump for them.
So the real point here that we all need to eventually figure out is that until we actually do follow these rules and take drastic measures, we're actually never going to come out of this. It's just not, we can't. We have to basically respect the realities of where we are and what we're doing. So given the fact that we're all on somewhat of a pause, but what does that pause look like for the three of you? What are you doing to be productive and to keep yourself at least thinking that you're still in the game, that you're at least doing something that's kind of pushing you in a direction? Cody, how are you using this time?
I mean, for me, the last year has truly been the most busy year I've ever had in my career, and that's because on the one hand, there's the quickly shutting down shows and now, preparing them to reopen. And development on new work continues as it would have. It's just now we're meeting, on Zoom versus meeting in a rehearsal room somewhere. But then on top of that,
how do you feel about Zoom for development? How's that working for you?
It's miserable. I hate it. And for the most part, when I say we're developing on Zoom, that's meetings with the writer and the composer and the director and the creative team. I'm not doing a lot of table reads or things like that, unless if an author comes to me and said, "Look, I'm at the point where I need to hear this out loud," 100%, if that's useful to them. But in terms of kind of the standard steps you take to develop a show, I haven't found that to be very useful on most shows.
Okay, that does everything I've been saying for 10 months. Okay. I see it a little different, but let's go to Katy. Katy, how are you using this time? Are you using it for development?
Yes. As a sort of, commercial producing, I've only really been doing for sort of 4 years. So I'm at a point where in the UK, when I raise money, I'm doing a project by project every time, approaching same investors, new investors. So instead, I sort of took a time to go, what would happen if I found one investor that believed in new musicals and could help me create a fund to actually stop and go, right, let's commission 5 shows. So I took some attention to think of the bigger picture rather than going so fast from show to show to show, which has always been my way. So it gave me some time to pause. So that was one thing I did. We have a few shows in development, and we launched an award, a commissioning award, to develop a new British Chamber musical. We received 160 submissions, and we're currently going through to take forward 8 into sort of next stage before we then commission the final one. And then I've completely restructured the business. So half of my time is spent rebooking all my national tours, which are my bigger shows that bring me in a proper producer fee and general management fee and royalty. And then thinking, okay, how can I stay relevant and how can I stay current? And I did a reach out on social media where I have a lot of engagement with writers on Twitter. And I found several new projects, which are either innovative, small scale projects where I'm going to partner with great theatres, put them on the stage and make a creative film out of them, and then distribute that online to sort of give that show a sort of almost like it's CD release before a musical is released. It might get an album. This might be a video that actually then I could show it to Neil and I can show it to Cody and go, look what we're creating here. This is something that could tour. It's a one-man show, to your country or whatever. So, and looking at sort of smaller projects we can digitize or we can create, and we can potentially make a little bit of capital from it, using small investment, but also applying for grants from the government project by project for subsidy to invest into these projects, which is not all, it's very hard to get the money, but if it's innovative and out the box, sometimes you can. And I don't have to do that. I could sit back and go, is it worth that effort for £2,000 or £3,000? Because the work to make a tiny little bit of profit on a stream show is hard. It doesn't get the same amount of engagement. But for me, I like to stay present and I like to stay active and I like to stay engaged with the community. And if I can make some jobs by doing a filming with 6 people there and then a Zoom musical with 8 people there, I will engage with those works that take my, that attract me. So I am still here. We have to make work in a way that is viable right now rather than rushing, because if we rush and it's not right for the people, then we're going to get ourselves into more of a mess. So I would say it's about evolving and staying on top of the future of the larger scale stuff that we've got.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that. Yeah, basically, it's we all have to be realistic about what we have. This sounds silly, but I have a philosophy of life. Basically, I use the resources that I can find. That's how I make dinner. I go to the refrigerator and I see what the ingredients are that I have, and then I put them together. So yeah, I think this is
best leftovers. That's a new thing on Netflix that I watched. They do that. Don't know if it's out in the US.
You would never know. You would never know they were leftovers, because I use them really well.
No, that's what I mean. They make them into a gourmet meal.
Yeah. So Neil, for you, what has this time been for? How have you been using this time?
So initially, when I listened to, I'm just sort of meeting Katy properly on here for the first time, but honestly, you could take everything Katy said and just go, Neil said that. And I know Cody well, but essentially the 3 of us, to some extent, are in that phase of our careers where it's us and a laptop, and I've got an associate producer, but so we are very much, and I've done it from the time I was 20 years old. You go show to show to show, and you're always hustling and you're always getting the next project and working with the next writers. So the first few days of shock for me were the financial losses on shows and unproducing, which is my new favorite and simultaneously least favorite phrase of all time. But that was the first week, was just unproducing shows and just being shell shocked by going, we're going to lose how much money in Australia on bridges in Madison County and all those sort of things. And then I had this wave of just going, if I have no shows and the world shuts down and I have to quarantine for the next 4 weeks, I can get back to every email that I haven't had the chance to reply to and clear my inbox and all those things. So I honestly went through this 4 weeks of going, everything's great. This is like forced time to clean up. But the problem is with what Cody does and what Katy do and what I do, we're used to finding the next thing to work on. And so then I've had to split myself into a few very distinct phases, which is to go, well, all the shows that I was working on, they're done. or I'll try and salvage them when I can salvage them. But then I've got this other raft of shows where I'm working with writers out of NYU developing that, and I've got this, and they're all sort of 3 to 5 year plans that you go, nothing about COVID needs to stop that really. And so they've kept going. And in fact, I've got more of those, a bit like Katy. So there's actually been more of those coming to me. And then very specifically for me, I guess a couple of things. One is I was relatively new to living in New York. I'd only been there for 9 months. And so I used the time to reach out to a lot of the people on this call through TRU, through CTI, and actually just went, I'm at home every day and I've got Zoom, which I hadn't used before. And I was scheduling meetings every half an hour and just meeting because all the people that I know in Australia and the network of people that I just grew up doing this for 20 years, I suddenly went to New York and went, I know some people and I know people that are doing things, but I don't know the writers and the directors and the people that I built a career on in Australia with developing new works. So that was a fascinating process, exhausting as well, but amazing, because I know there's a whole web of people that I have never met in person. And things like the TRU stuff, I was getting onto every theatre conference, every theatre discussion I could, because I went, well, what the heck have I got to do? I'll sit out on the fire escape and sit in the sun and just learn who people are and what they're working on and what they want to do and how they all fit together, because this is not my home grounds. I'm starting life anew in New York. And then a bizarre, so as an example, the strange way that COVID worked, I then got approached to direct this production of Who's Your Bag Daddy. So I usually spend my time sort of 50-50 being producing and directing. And I had assumed that directing just would die for the next year. But then in hindsight, I've been asked to direct several readings on Zoom, which, are not perfect, but they work. And then this Who's Your Bag Daddy idea got pitched to me, which I thought was insanity, because this Australian team was saying, well, what we can do under Australia's rules is we can get what we ended up doing was getting a massive Airbnb house and putting 8 people into 8 different rooms in that house. And because the only way you can avoid the latency and lag of sound is at that point was to have them all in the same room and actually, put it all through a sound mixer. And so I ended up directing this show over 3 weeks. So I was sitting up all night, every night on Zoom, directing all this team that were in a variety of either at their own homes or in a room together. And it was just the world's biggest social experiment. We had no idea what we were doing. We had no idea what digital theatre or that sort of version of, putting a show into a digital space was. And it was enormous fun. And it's on Broadway HD now, so people can go and watch it. But so there was that, creatively, there was that. And there's always the chance for what I do. There's always the chance to sit and write a new show or to storyboard a new show and go, when the chance comes up, I've got shows that are made for small theatres. I've got shows that are going to be made for medium theatres, for large theatres. I don't know which one's going to be, possible. And I don't know which country is going to be the next available opportunity, but at least I'm ready. And then Drummer Queens came out of that. So Drummer Queens started for me 6 years ago. And COVID was my chance to go to the writer of that and say, we've been talking about this show for 6 years. You have nothing to do for the next 6 months. Sit down and finish off this show. And then we did a workshop presentation in Sydney in September, October that we were absolutely rushing. And then out of that, we suddenly are opening in this gap between Pippin just closed on the weekend and Hamilton opens in 3 weeks. We are the gap in Sydney that opens that show then in a 2,000 seat theatre. And, we're madly scrambling to keep up with the ridiculous time frame that I put us all on. But suddenly the show is going to exist and then we're going to be shopping it to, the world in the next few weeks.
So Cody, do you think that New York can learn something from what Australia has been doing and from the approach that Neil has been taking? Do you think there's a chance that we can do some similar things?
Yeah, I think the lucky thing for us is, South Korea, Australia, London, they're going through the exact same things. It's, getting a bunch of people into a theater to see a show and dealing with the backstage traffic. And, there's a weekly call, not just with our colleagues in other countries, but also our colleagues at theme parks and professional sporting events. And, we know how to do this safely. It's a matter now of getting the government to sign off and the unions to sign off and raising the money to do it. But we know how to do it. And as we get closer to more people being vaccinated, some of those barriers, will even start to fade away. So I thank you both and your colleagues for helping us, develop a game plan that we can more or less take and tweak and run with.
So one of our attendees wants to know, can't we move things outdoors, Central Park? Well, the answer to that, actually, next Friday, I've got Carla Polk Miller from the Mayor's Office of Entertainment and Media and Entertainment, and she's going to talk about the city's plans. The city has initiatives to actually move theater into outdoor spaces, but that's not exactly what Katy, Neil, and Cody do. They, although I guess it's not outside the realm of feasibility. Would you guys ever want to be involved in an outdoor or site specific piece?
I mean, I think there's a
Yeah.
difference between saying you want to do a piece outdoors because it serves the piece and saying I can't do a piece indoors. You know, the problem with outdoor theater in New York is, you know, it's only nice maybe 4 months out of the year, or it's too hot or too cold. You can only do things at night if you want any kind of lighting. It rains a lot. You know, there's Shakespeare in the Park works, I think, because it's free and it's a unique experience and people deal with the noise and everything else. But I think to do commercial theater large scale outside of New York isn't really feasible outside of kind of one-off productions, or this thing, you know, our governor is planning, where there's going to be some kind of, let's kickstart, you know, theaters back in the world, come see it. That will be mostly outdoors, but I think kind of as a wholesale change in the industry, that probably won't happen.
And outdoor performances are really suited. Sydney at the moment has, on very short notice, set up a stage, and so has Melbourne, where we're getting quite well-known pop artists and musicians. I mean, outdoor is really ideally suited to contemporary music. And when we're setting up contemporary music outdoors, it's going really well. In Sydney, we have the Handa Opera so there's a great thing in summer here every year where there's outdoor cinemas. There's Opera Australia does a big production, like a very ambitious production on the harbour on an outdoor stage overlooking the city. So there are some things that exist like that, but it's not the solution to. It's not going to sustain every theatre producer that has shows, because a lot of shows, and particularly small to medium shows, that there's no outdoor venue that would work for them. You know, you can do outdoor operas on a larger scale. You can do some, like West Side Story was done on the harbour in Sydney, but they have to be quite grand musicals to translate to any form of outdoor.
Well, similar to the way some of us are using virtual, we can give an idea of the show virtually. We can there might be ways of giving an idea of a show that we're planning by doing an outdoor production of it. But everybody has to come with the understanding that it's not necessarily the show. It's just a way of giving you a taste of what's coming. So I think so much of what we can be doing now are paving the way for the return to live theater. It's not easy, and it's. Some of you are doing more than others in terms of that. We also don't know when it's going to. How can you plan when you don't know when you're going to be able to open? How do you rent a theater on spec? If we're open in October, can we have your theater? And how many people do they promise that to, since they don't know if it's going to be open in October? It's.
And how do you build a tour? Like that's if you're dealing with one theater, but if you're dealing with 20 theaters on a tour, that's impossible.
Katy's going to answer that one, because she's been working on her tours. So tell us how you're doing that.
It's horrendous. I mean, just to the point about the outdoor, obviously we had Regent's Park Open Air Theatre do the Jesus Christ Superstar socially distant show. They were one of the first back. Our government said, oh, you can open outdoor spaces first, socially distant, then maybe in a couple of months indoor. And they did that. I did Contact. I was attracted to that because it was specifically written in a COVID world. So it was all about contact, and the audience was socially distant walking through the experience. And so I was attracted to that because it was enhanced by that experience, rather than it was forced to do that because of we couldn't do it indoors. It would never be done indoors. You have to experience all of the sort of sky, architecture around you. Touring. So as I think I mentioned earlier, maybe I did another talk earlier, I can't remember.
You did.
There are only sort of 35, 40 number one touring venues for musicals. So everybody wants them. So you've got all the product that stopped in March, that moved first to autumn. Then you've got the people that were starting in autumn also, being moved forward. And right now we've moved our tour 3 times. And we're nervous now because we think, basically, in a nutshell, in the UK, the last 2 weeks, we thought maybe we'd be open by the summer and then the autumn. but the vaccine's rolling out too slowly. We've got a delay in the second dose of the vaccine. We've only vaccinated 8 million people out of 65 million. We don't know how effective it is yet. There's new strains. We're not sure. So the reality, could I really start my rehearsal in July for an August opening? It doesn't feel feasible. I don't even know how I keep my cast safe. And can I really afford £1,000 of testing every week on a small play that only costs 30,000 a week? So ultimately, we're all going, oh my gosh, we might have to move our shows till 2022 unless the government go, we know we're going to be socially distant in the autumn. Here's some money to subsidize you for 25% lost revenue. There is a conversation that some shows might take that offering because they think, you know what? Great, I get my running costs covered. I get my general management fee. I'm happy. But your Book of Mormons and your Les Mis, your Phantom and your Disney's Lion King and the Beauty and the Beast, they're going to go into 2022 and sit in these theaters for 4 weeks each and eat up all of the venues for us producers with smaller shows like the Addams Family. So we're all very nervous that we'll all be bumped till 2023 soon. But right now, until February, nobody's making that call. I think for me, I will manage as a smaller producer to take advantage of all those venues that are brilliant venues that are free this autumn that need product and go, you know what? You can give me a guarantee for the last 5 years and I'll fill your theatre for a week. And I'm thinking, how can I utilize some of my smaller scale shows to sit in these brilliant venues that sell out at 90% usually for, you know, your Lion King or your Billy Elliot, and go in and hopefully put in some smaller products. So this is the million questions going through my head every single hour of every single day.
I have a question for you about that. If you're going into a big space with a small show, it's not just a question of, you know, the social distanced audience. It's also, how do you redesign or reconfigure your small show for a huge stage?
Well, it's when I say small show, that's what I mean by that is small force show, you know, a show that only has a company of 10 rather than a company of 30. Of course, I don't want the show to drown and get lost in a barn of a theatre, and I need to think about the artistic integrity. But our theatres are quite intimate, even our large scale theatres, that's, you know, that's Matcham theatres. So to create that intimacy by filling the stalls in the circle half and keeping the gods empty and keeping people forward, I really think a redesign of the last 5 years to an end, because we did it in thrust, but we put it in an end on theatre, it could really still translate. So I mean more about the running costs being low as possible and theatres needing product. But at the same time, some of these theatres are like, I can't take the risk on your small show. It's not really going to make us any money. I might as well just shut until next year and cut our losses and keep our running costs as low as possible. And nobody's really communicating. They don't know if they've got enough product. The producers don't know if they can take their shows out. And I'm telling you, it's really dicey because despite this $1 billion investment, these theatres are going to lose more money, and we're going to lose some of our most important theatres through this. And I don't know how the US theatres are even continuing full stop because they've had no subsidy. So, but we're going to lose a whole generation of theatre makers and venues and product. We're going to be delayed product.
And because there's also a thing to consider, and this is going to sound like I'm all doom and gloom, which I tend not to. I think every producer, like by nature, we tend to be optimists and we tend to be a bit crazy in what we think can work and push it out there. And I've been very gung-ho on being first in the market, say into Australia, and I'll do the same Off-Broadway. But there's a sting in the tail. If you were first in the market in London, you got slaughtered. And if you are first in the market in Australia at the moment, which I am, it's not going great. But the other thing to think about is, and Australia, like I said, doesn't have the same thing. The tourist factor in London and in the USA is just a major factor for whether shows can survive. But the other one is that I feel like people aren't factoring in as much, particularly in the USA, is that you don't need a pandemic for theatre to have a downturn. All you need is not great economic circumstances, and ticket buyers generally run a little bit scared for a while because it's discretionary money and they want to pay food and they want to pay rent first. I don't hear that many producers at the moment. Everything's about when can we get back on stage logistically, and when what will people be in masks and what. But what I don't hear many people factoring in is going, there is going to be a huge economic tail to this, which isn't going to be great. Like there's been a lot of people out of work, and so I go that will also for a while. I think that's what Cody was saying about reductions in ticket prices will probably have to happen for a while, and reductions in costs, because there's just going to be an economic fallout that I feel like the media is so focused on the pandemic, which it has to be, that the economic fallout of this pandemic is going to be long lasting, I would imagine. Like
for us, if I'm not mistaken, Cody, one of our big expenses is the theater itself, and I'm not sure how negotiable things are going to be in terms of the price of renting a theater, but that seems to be one of the areas where the government could and should jump in, subsidizing the theaters themselves, so that at least that cost becomes more affordable. Any thoughts about that?
In terms of commercial theater, the theater is 45% of any show's budget. The theater itself, at least talking about Broadway commercial theater, they're just taking a percentage of the ticket sales. So there's not kind of this, looming rent payment the way you might pay rent for an apartment or an office. It's, they're taking their cut off the top, and you have to guarantee every week that you're going to deliver, a minimum, whether you sell that many tickets or not. And we have, it's certainly not the support that will save the industry, but we did just recently get $15 billion in what was formerly called the Save Our Stages Act and is now the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. That's a meaningful amount of money, though. Like 15 billion spread across every live entertainment venue in America isn't much, but that will be a meaningful amount of money to restart Broadway shows and major regional theaters and things like that.
Okay, so I want to remind the room that, in case you probably don't know, that your virtual hand raise is at the bottom of your screen if you open up the reactions button there, reactions, there should be a virtual hand raise there. Some of you who have an older version of Zoom, if you go into participants, the virtual hand raise is normally located in the lower left-hand corner of your participants window. So I do want to bring everybody into the conversation. I do want to know whether you have questions for the panel. And I also know that Katy it's very late for Katy. Are you still with us, or do you need to leave yet?
I am tired, but I'm happy to answer a question if anyone has one. And then maybe I'll go to bed.
So Murray Davis, and then Lee Roscoe. Murray. Okay, you're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted. It was terrific, I have to tell you. It was very informative. This is a question for Katy. I have just taken on a play. It is a farce, an unbelievably funny farce. The plan is to do it in New York, but off-Broadway, and take it to London. You mentioned about musicals being the thing. I realize it's not going to happen this moment, but do you see, because it feels like it's the right thing for the London market, do you see that in the, let's say, 6 months to a year? Can you project that, or if that would be the thing?
Well, if London has the play that goes wrong was a huge hit. So London does well with farce.
Okay, that can be the answer.
No, well, Katy.
London's a great market. I mean, for a new play, Kenny Wax is quite a remarkable producer with bringing the play that goes wrong to market, and then Six the musical with no track record for either shows, and making them almost become some huge successes. Introducing a play here, there's a couple of ways you can produce it independently and build its profile in the way that Play That Goes Wrong did, or you can find a subsidized theatre that might want to program it because they think it's brilliant, or off the back of the success in New York, it gets that profile. It's much easier to produce independently here, much smaller budgets, much easier to book a good theatre if the play is good. I would say that in terms of 6 months, I mean, I have to be honest, I personally don't feel
a year, go out a year.
Fine. Yeah, a year from now, I think we'll be starting to open up at full capacity. But I think you know, getting a theatre, getting them engaged now when they're backlogged with product is an issue. But you know, we're all relentless. That's why we do what we do. We wouldn't be here if we weren't carrying on knocking on doors. So if we have to wait 2 years for that project, we wait. You know, if it's the right move, if it's the right route to market. But yeah, definitely consider London, because we do like fast, and I do think, you know, uplifting material is going to be, I think, embraced quite well.
Okay, I'll be talking to you. Thank you. For sure. Bye-bye.
Lee Roscoe?
I may have missed some of this. Forgive me. I had to leave for a while. If so, I'll get it when you email me. But have any of you produced specifically for Zoom? And if so, how did you monetize it?
Or did you monetize it?
Or did you?
So the Who's Your Baghdaddy that I directed, I didn't produce, although I was pretty much advising the producers on how to produce it as well. We keep talking like it's produced for Zoom. It actually has nothing to do with Zoom at all. Like that would be a disastrous way to try and present most things, and particularly a musical. The monetizing is tricky. They did monetize it. They were selling tickets like it was a theatre show. So we did 5 performances live to the internet, which was in hindsight the most ridiculous idea of all time, but we got away with it and managed to do it. So there was no pre-recording. There was a lot of pre-editing and a software that allowed us to manipulate the footage that came live out of the cameras into where I wanted to move boxes to and to color them and all sorts of things. But the monetization at that point, and this was back in May, June, where everything was relatively new, the monetization was hard. They didn't cover their costs with that, and that now that it's streaming on Broadway HD, they'll get a little bit trickling back through. But then, you know, the world matures and producers learn off each other and get smarter, and nobody has yet. I do know of projects that are like The Gift that was done in LA and stuff, that people are finding out ways to monetize digital experiences. And even though it wasn't a true thing, obviously the amount of viewers that Ratatouille the musical just got is, you know, a remarkable feat. That's a year's worth of Broadway audience in a project that didn't exist 6 weeks before it went to live. Now, the monetization of that was done as a donation basis, but they raised a lot of money for the Actors Benevolent Fund. But you know, that I think people will start finding ways of doing this to a point that they haven't at the moment. Most projects at the moment cannot monetize themselves to cover the cost of doing it, particularly if the cost is having to deal with equity in America.
Well, yeah, we're stuck in a between equity and SAG-AFTRA. There are certain things that have been resolved and certain things that they think have been resolved, but if you look at them closely, they're still confusing and confounding, in fact. So yeah, we're dealing with relatively higher costs for some of us than what we're used to doing in early development. Early development live is relatively affordable for most of us. On Zoom, on virtual, the contract that Equity and SAG offer are a little bit more expensive than what we've had in the past. Let's see. Anybody else have any questions? The other thing I wanted to tell you, because of the fact that I was knocked off of this Zoom actually twice since we started, I don't have the full chat. So if you want to actually put your email into the chat, if you had put it in earlier, it's not in my chat anymore, although hopefully Jay will have a full chat that I can share with everybody. Please, everybody, questions. Katy, by the way, had to leave. She was exhausted. It's after midnight for her, and so it was actually very gracious of her to spend a late night with us as it was. Neil, we didn't establish what time it was for you. It's not so bad.
It is now 11:15 on Friday morning. So if you want to know your futures, just ask me, because I can tell you how things are going.
Okay, great. Any other questions from the room? Any other comments or discussions? Cody, did you want to add anything else to what you've been talking about in terms of what you're doing and what your plans had? But I think the exact question is, how do you plan for the future when you don't know when the future is going to be here, when you don't know when it's going to happen?
I mean, I think all you can do is you know, plan to a timeline, and you can pick up that timeline and place it on the calendar once you know, we know what's going on. I'm pretty confident in our reopening plans. That being said, 9 months ago, I was confident in that reopening date. But I mean, it's looking very realistic that this summer we're going to have at least a few shows on Broadway. You know, as an industry, we have been very vocal publicly and behind the scenes that we won't reopen until we can do so at 100% capacity. So, you know, you may see some off-Broadway shows that, you know, can play by a different set of rules that might even open sooner than that. But I'd say just get going, make your plans, and be flexible. And to your point earlier, Bob, I actually did sign a theater agreement that has, you know, an estimated date in there, but the language basically gives us the first slot. So we're planning to open in the middle of October, but if that first slot becomes January, like that's what it is tied to.
So in other words, it becomes the theater's first available slot once we reopen. So that's how it's negotiated.
Exactly. Now,
Okay.
I don't know what they do once they get to show, you know, 2, 3, and 4 behind us, because that could get very messy and, you know, like trying to read tea leaves. But people are trying to put agreements in place, so the moment we get the go ahead, we can hit the ground running.
Well,
But it is a tricky thing, because I'm in a similar position with the theatre off Broadway for a 2-person play that I'm hoping to be. I've always hoped that there's going to be a gap between when off Broadway is allowed to reopen on a you know, with the fewer number of people that are in theatres, and then when Broadway is going to suddenly be blasting away with millions of dollars of marketing money simultaneously trying to outdo each other, at which point I think off Broadway is going to have a tricky time getting any oxygen. But like Cody, I mean, we've got a sort of a vague deal with the theatre that goes, when we can reopen, and we don't know when that is, you can come in. But that has on-flow effects. That makes it tricky to go, is it tone deaf or not to be raising money at the moment? And even if you can raise money, you know, it never helps to go and ask for money to go, we've sort of got a deal and we'll maybe be opening here, but it could go to, so it does have an on-flow effect, but I just think you have to be as ready as you can. That's sort of my view with it. And also, like I said before, have small shows, medium shows, large shows, and go, who knows where the opportunity is going to, like the idea that we were going to go into a 2,000 seat theatre before Hamilton with drummer queens was insanity 4 months ago, but that's what happened.
So Cody, back to your situation with the first slot. I would think, first of all, if you're negotiating for a theater, how do they negotiate the show that's going to? I see. I've never done this. How do they negotiate the show that's going to come in after yours?
That happens all the time. Like generally at the Broadway level, when you see a show announcing that they'll be opening, you know, in the fall, but a theater, you know, a Schubert house to be determined. Generally, that means there's a show in that theater that's struggling. The theater owners are always lining up 2, 3, 4, 5 shows deep, and usually that number 2 or 3 show, like you're into the nitty gritty of negotiating. So it's not kind of a new paradigm to have a theater deal that's a little ambiguous. That's, you know, the standard. It's just in years past, you were waiting for a show to close. Now we're waiting for the theater to reopen.
But nevertheless, you said it's going to be dicey for the people that are in second and third and fourth in line.
Well, it just becomes you add another layer of opaqueness and of uncertainty, right? If I'm the first show opening, I'm on these calls with the industry and our government officials every week, so I think I have a pretty good idea of when that first set will open. But will there be another outbreak that causes us to close? Will we, you know, one of a million things that could make that second show not be able to look at us and our ticket sales and kind of predict, well, I think they're going to last this long. There's just so many more variables now that it becomes kind of muddy.
Well, let's just hope that we now have a light at the end of the tunnel, even though we're not exactly sure where that tunnel ends, but we see the flicker. There's a vaccine. Now we have the problem. It's just so crazy. Now we have the problem that our administration didn't really have a good plan in terms of how to distribute the vaccine. So great, we got a vaccine, and nobody's getting it, but we have it. Isn't that nice to know? So there are many unknowns. I think if the new administration has a plan and if it works, we have a chance at this point of getting to a point where immunity is possible for enough of the population And treatments is the other aspect of it. I think that they're working on treatments as well, so that COVID isn't as necessarily deadly. Then on the other hand, we have new strains of it. We're still in the place of the unknown. So the only thing that we know right now is that we need to wear masks. We need to be safe. We need to keep socially distant. And we need to not jump the gun on this, because if we jump ahead too fast, we're going to go through what London has gone through. Basically, they open, they close, they open, they close, they open, they close. So let's just stay on this course towards actual safe opening for all of us. And let's all remember to be safe. Remember to play by the rules and respect the mighty virus, because it's there and it doesn't care who we are.
And I think that's the main rule to look. Because I know a lot of Americans are saying to me, well, now that Australia's open, why can't we just be doing what Australia does? Or I think we were all looking at South Korea and going, why can't we just do what South Korea does? And the end result is, to do what we're doing in Australia basically meant you had to be down to having no cases of the virus. Like, it is about how you clean theaters. It is about wearing masks. It is about how you stagger entry times. That's all required. But the fundamental basis that where Australia is just so vastly different to America is that we have no coronavirus. And when it breaks out, our theaters get impacted instantly. Like one case of coronavirus in Brisbane shut the city down for 3 days. And that meant that Shrek got shut down and didn't open for a week. But that's the fundamental difference. You can't have coronavirus walking around the streets and then have a theater open, because it will just, the minute there's a coronavirus case in a theater, which hasn't happened in Australia, it hasn't happened in South Korea, but the minute there's a case that happens in a theater, then there will be carnage. So with the vaccine has to be rolled out quickly.
So hopefully that will happen, and hopefully we'll all see normal days again. I know it seems remote to many of us. Happy Blur's Day. Everything is Blur's Day now. But hopefully we will reach a point where we can, guys, I hate to play the HIV card, but we went through this in the 80s. And the 80s, the havoc, the damage that AIDS was wreaking took 10 years to contain. 10 years before there was a cocktail that was effective and that people could live through this. So the fact that we're moving as fast as we are right now, we should be very, very grateful. So I think this is another thing that we could really be practicing during this time, is opening our hearts to gratitude for what we do have and what we can do, and the rate. Just look at the rays of hope that are there, because there is hope now. So that's all I wanted to say. So everybody can come back into the room and say goodbye, and say thank you to Neil and Cody and Katy, who's already left us because it's late there. Anybody want to say hi or say something?
I'll say hello.
Hello, Denise.
So say this has been so sadly realistic. You're all dealing with commercial theater. I am a one-woman, three-character play. So this leaves me with little hope. But
and actually, what you have is a much easier thing to produce.
I was going to say, I think that flexibility gives you way more. It's going to be much easier to get your show into a theater somewhere to a smallish audience than it is to open Wicked on Broadway. So I think you're much more flexible.
That goes back to what I was saying, which let's spend the time focusing on the positives. I didn't put it that way, but that's the way I should have put it. And the positive for you definitely is that you're an easy show to produce, and you don't require 1,000 people in the audience anyway. We can perform it for 20 people or 40 people or whatever. So go, girl, you go.
Thank all of you.
Frank, did you want to say something?
Just that. Hang on.
No, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. I've been on a lot of Zoom with a lot of really great organizations, but the panelists, the level of discussion was like getting oxygen for me. And I'm not a producer at all. I'm at the performer, playwright, writer level, but I loved the candidness and experience. I learned a lot of things I had questions for, but didn't know where to turn for answers, because of course I'm concerned. Theater has been my whole life, right? So I'm isolated, I'm in Savannah, and I can't get a sense of anything because the public face of a lot of these great organizations and theaters, they're being positive, but they're also not telling you a lot of facts. And I'm really like wondering what's actually happening. And this entire evening, I learned so much, and I love learning the angle of Australia and London. I know enough about America because I lived in New York most of my life, but that's been wonderful. I just want to say, as an organizer, thank you, because it was such a high level of discussion and so much professional experience and so well articulated.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
You might
Jill-
say that Bob Ost is the host with the most.
Oh, God. Gee, I never heard that before, did I?
can't help myself.
Dylan in Yorkshire. Did Katy portray the country as you know it, as you're familiar with it? Did you recognize England?
Yes. It's the not knowing. It's like everyone. Nobody knows what's happening. But it's gone from really relaxed to really strict to really relaxed to really strict, and it seems to change almost every week. So if it had been really strict all the way through, I think we'd be in a better place. But it's the not knowing. It's the not knowing.
I agree with that. Diane in Vancouver, Canada has been very, very good through all of this. You've been particularly smart because you won't let any American cross your border. Good for you.
Yes, thank you. We're quite proud of that.
Yeah.
So Vancouver, you don't have what we have, do you?
Well, not really. I mean, we're still in semi lockdown, and we're still struggling like the rest of the world, but I don't think the numbers are quite as high now.
We're winning.
Yeah.
So anybody else want to say a few words before we close up and I go make dinner? Larry.
Hey everybody. Yeah, I have a friend, you probably know her name, Sammy Candle. She's a director, she's a friend of mine. And she went to South Korea to help direct, they're doing Phantom there. And her experience was amazing. She got there and she got off the plane and they said, we're taking you to a army barracks for 2 weeks and you are not allowed to leave your room. And it turned out she was very lucky. It wasn't an army barracks, it was actually a hotel. Every morning they would come into her room and there would be somebody who would check her temperature. They would push food underneath the door. They had a special slot. If anybody tries to leave their room within those 2 weeks, they're immediately put on a plane and sent home. But the problem is in America, we have such a love for individualism and, don't tell me how to live my life. And, I'm going to live my life the way I say, and the government is go to hell. I don't know that we could put up with that, but if we did, we could solve this problem, but it would take being willing to give up our individual freedoms for at least 2 weeks.
Well, I think the new administration is going to take a firmer stand, but that doesn't mean that they're going to get pushback. I'm a little concerned about what's going to happen, but at least
and that's very much Australia's experience, Larry. So that's I've done that twice now coming to Australia. That it's 14 days in a hotel, can't open a window. We don't have windows. You don't have a hotel room key. The interesting thing, I don't know if it's making the news over there, is in Melbourne, the Australian Open, the tennis Open, is still trying to push ahead. And to do that, they brought over plane loads of players and coaches and support staff. And every single plane load basically had a case of coronavirus on it. So everybody, all these very high, wealthy players are all in quarantine in Melbourne, and several of them are getting quite outspoken about, their liberties being taken. But they want to travel the world and play tennis. So, and I was hearing on the New York Daily podcast yesterday. The one thing about Australia being able to protect from the variations of the Brazilian strain and the English strain is you basically have to close
and
your
the new African strain.
The African strain is you basically, I think America's approach now is you close the borders. You don't let English people come to America. You don't let Brazilian people come in. But they said the problem is, historically, is that almost every time a virus has been brought into into America. It's Americans that are living in it or that have been in London that are coming home with the virus. So they're not stopping Americans coming in, and they're not quarantining Americans coming in. So I don't know.
And we already have our first detected case in America of the African strain. So we're just as, America's still on top of things. We're just right there at the cutting edge. Good Lord. So anyone else want to say hi before we close up and say goodnight? Okay. Good night, everybody. Thanks for being with us. And
Good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.
If you
Thank
don't know,
you. Good night.
if you don't know about tomorrow's Zoom meetings, shoot me an email or put something into the chat saying that you'd like to be on the Zoom list, and we'll send you the link for tomorrow, and you'll get to hear Jane Dubin and RK Green talk about how they're dealing with things as well. Okay, Neil, thank you for thank you for bringing Australia to us.
See, well, I'm back in New York on the 1st of March and happy to meet up. I'll see you then, Cody, when I'm back.
Bye.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Cody.
Good night, everyone.
Night. Thank you.
Be healthy, be safe.